Greetings and salutations, everybody, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Vagelan, and I am in for Jason Miles tonight, who is taking a well-earned rest. So before we begin the show, I would like to remind everybody to like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have made 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, so thank you, everybody who has supported us so far. Now, don't worry, we don't have a full B team lineup today. Joining me tonight for our very special show is, of course, the one, the only, the man of the Mau Hour, Mr. Pascal Robert. Welcome, Pascal.
Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings, Jean Bajlan.
How you doing?
No soundboard. For those who did not check it out yet, you can check out my appearance on Kyle and Crystal. I posted, I think, over the weekend. You should check it out. It was pretty good.
Yeah, it was a good performance, and you can get it on Audible, I discovered.
It is on Audible as well. That is correct. Check that out. I'm looking forward to today's conversation with the article written in Reason magazine. I'm going to give Matthew a nice little interrogation about what's up with my man being published in Reason.
And, of course, in the background, we have the voice of reason. We have M. Tucson here. Hey, M. Tucson, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. So M. Tucson will be here to keep us on the straight and narrow. And of course, to help us talk about our subject today, I talk with Matthew Petti, who's written an article, as Pascal has said, in Reason magazine, is our foreign policy expert, the one, the only, Deep State Cuba. Hey, Cuba, how's it going?
Hello, everyone. If M. Toussaint gets to be the voice of reason, can I at least be the necktie of reason?
You can be the necktie of reason. You've been torturing Ewoks.
Nice. You put them in enough isolation and darkness, and the Ewoks torture themselves.
Well, yeah,
that's actually something I learned from my training trip to Israel.
There we go. Well, that leads us nicely into our next, in our topic for the day, which is the police exchanges that are taking place between Israel and the United States and the importation of Israeli policing techniques to small-town America. And joining us to discuss it in detail, based on an article he wrote in Reason magazine, is a return guest to the show. He is I think, former person of the Quincy Institute. He's a writer. He's a journalist. He is a Fulbright scholar. He is also the foreign policy Fonzie. He is the one, the only, Matthew Petti. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me on.
Matthew Petti.
Yeah, look at that. It's got a gold chain.
Yeah, that's new.
Yeah, that's new. That's
but
beautiful.
Feels so natural.
I was like, you were making the Fonzie jokes, and I was going around.
I see you channeling your inner paisan. I can see that.
Yeah, but he says it's a joke, but he must have had a gold chain lying around.
Are you kidding? He has a shelf of gold chains. He had to pick one.
It's silver. It's silver.
It's silver. Sorry.
Yeah.
So Matthew, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to, on the Fulbright thing, I'm not a Fulbright scholar yet, which is why I'm totally free to say whatever I want.
Oh, you can say whatever you want. Why did they make you sign a non-disclosure form on Fulbright?
No, it just once I started, I have to if I do a media appearance or something, I have to do this disclaimer that what I'm saying is not the position of the Fulbright program or the U.S. State Department.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. What I'm saying is not the position of the State Department or the Fulbright program. I believe that pedophilia is wrong and children's adenocarcinoma glands should not be harvested. But I would like to clarify again. I'm only speaking for myself.
Okay, so let's get to today's topic because it's a really interesting, important topic. Now, Matthew, you wrote an article in Reason magazine where you talk about do small-town cops need training in Israeli counter-terror techniques. Now, before we kind of begin and before Pascal begins his interrogation about Reason magazine, can you give us a little bit of context about this article, how it came about, and what inspired you to write on this most, let's just say, spicy of topics?
Yeah, so actually it's pretty funny. I was I kind of hint at it in the beginning of the article because I cite a Sacha Baron Cohen skit, but that's more or less. So basically, in March, Jewish Currents had this really good report on the ADL strongly considering getting rid of their police exchanges, and they basically obtained, I don't know how, an internal ADL memo basically saying, well, this stuff gives us a lot of bad press, and the critics might be correct. So maybe we should quit doing this stuff. And I'm reading this article, and the thing that pops into, and this is in March, so that's when I kind of started looking into this topic.
Very, very quickly, could you just tell us who the ADL are, why they were even in the policing exchange business?
Sure. So the ADL, it started out as it's the Anti-Defamation League. Started out as, a Jewish American civil rights organization, one of many, immigrant civil rights organizations in the U.S. And it kind of became the go-to for police on hate crime stuff. And I'll get into this in the article and talking about the article, after 9/11, because of their pre-existing relationships with law enforcement and because of this kind of trend of bringing cops to Israel to train, they started doing it and became, I think, I don't know if anyone's compiled all the numbers, but I think they were the main or one of the main groups. They were one of only 3 groups bringing American police to Israel. And so it kind of became a point of tension where, this is a liberal civil rights organization that operates in the civil liberties space, but well, we'll get into it. They're bringing cops to another country that has paramilitary style policing and training them in that.
And an impeccable human rights record.
Yes. So, Jewish Currents published an article about this controversy and how the ADL itself was maybe we shouldn't be bringing cops to a controversial country with a reputation for this stuff. And I'm reading this article, and what pops into my head is a Sacha Baron Cohen character. Aaron Murad. It's this bit that Sacha Baron Cohen does where he pretends to, and he's Jewish British with family in Israel, so he knows this. He can do the character really well. He pretends to be an Israeli counterterrorism trainer going around to small town America to teach cops how to fight terror, and then gets American politicians to do completely stupid things. I think the most famous Aaron Murad sketch is when he got a Georgia state legislator to pull down his pants and shout the N-word, saying this will protect you from terrorism. And I linked to it in the article. It's just completely bizarre. And I'm like, this is kind of a good metaphor for this whole thing of this, why does a small town Georgia legislature think that he needs to learn how to defend himself from terrorist kidnappings?
And also the deference paid to Israeli security services, the kind of cult of the Mossad, the cult of the Shin Bet, the idea that these guys are the most badass and the most capable terrorism fighters leads to this weird Israeli magical thinking where the Israelis know better, but these Americans imagine that if you just do what they do, somehow that'll protect you without you even needing to connect the dots.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what I was going to get into. And so I started looking into how this came to be, and I mean, we can get into this if you want, the kind of year by year, because it's got a weirder and older history than most people realize. Most people imagine this is a post 9/11 thing, but it actually goes back a bit before then.
Yeah, that's actually where I wanted to touch in exactly. Where does this program have its origins? I like the fact that you talk about how it does begin pre 9/11. It actually starts in the most bizarre of all places in Atlanta, as a matter of fact, which I found fascinating because Atlanta is a city that has this rather extensive Black political class. But then if you actually look at some of these more interesting and nefarious relationships between various advocates of the state of Israel in the United States, the more you see their role with the Black political class, the less surprising it actually becomes. Can you actually talk about the origins of these programs and where they come from prior to 9/11?
So as far as I'm aware, the first group in America doing it, International Law Enforcement Exchange. It was founded by this guy, Robert Friedman. He's a criminologist. I think he was born in Israel. I know he speaks with an Israeli accent, and he told me he's got family there. he called me when I talked to him on the phone. He was in Israel. But yeah, I mean, he was in Georgia already, teaching criminology at Georgia State University, and Atlanta was getting ready in the 90s to host the 96 Summer Olympics. And, you know, Friedman, as he told it to me, the thing that flashed through his mind was images of Munich 1972, when the Palestinian guerrilla groups actually attacked the Israeli delegation of the Olympics and killed a bunch of them. And he's like, how can we prevent this happening in Georgia? Now, on one hand, you can say this is like a pretty far-fetched thing, like who's attacking Georgia 96. On the other hand, you know, to be entirely fair to him, there was a terrorist attack. You know, weirdly enough, or topically enough, it was an anti-abortion attacker who set off a bomb. So it wasn't an entirely misplaced fear. But he's basically like, who has experience with like defending large events from terrorism? Israel. And this is right after the first Intifada, which was the less violent of the two Palestinian uprisings in the West Bank and Gaza, but also like Israel had an extensive experience with guerrilla attacks and you know, terrorist attacks. I hate the word terrorist, but like, you know, like large mass casualty attacks against civilians. And so yeah, he decides to set up these U.S.-Israeli exchanges. He doesn't just do it with Israel. He also sets up exchanges with European countries. He told me that the Chinese government asked him to set up an exchange so that they could learn how to set up like the same kind of Israeli-style police training center in China. So he did that at the Chinese government's request. I don't know if he scrubbed it off the website since then, but there is a glowing review on the website where some American cop says, "Oh yeah, China has a different system of law than us, but it was great to learn about that." And also the State Department. I never asked the State Department, but he told me that the State Department also had them training post-Soviet police forces in like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in American-style policing. So that's, as far as I'm aware, that's where it started at the Georgia State University with this, you know, criminology professor who was Israeli and decided to do this as kind of a, I don't want to say pet project, but it was like a personal interest. And then 9/11 though is what made it take off because, you know, there's this, you know, it's happening at the height of the Second Intifada, which is a much more violent Palestinian uprising, which much more aggressively targeted Israeli civilians. I, you know, don't think it's any surprise that Americans saw a link between the Islamist terrorism in New York and, you know, the Palestinian uprising. And New York actually was kind of the second city to get into this. They sent solidarity delegations to Israel. They set up a NYPD permanent office there. And were really, you know, New York, which had borne the brunt of 9/11, was like, we're going to really learn from the Israelis, which we'll get into where that got New York in a lot of trouble. But then, you know, this think tank called Jewish Institute for National Security of America, I'm not making that name up. I know it sounds kind of anti-Semitic, but that's what they call themselves. They had been doing U.S.-Israeli military exchanges, like, you know, generals and stuff, officers. And now they're like, okay, we're going to start bringing police departments like the Georgia program. In recent years, they've been funded a lot by Bernie Marcus, the Home Depot founder, big Atlanta businessman who also funds the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. And then I think after all this is in full swing, the ADL kind of has to play catch up. And so they start their own counterterrorism school with trips to Israel sometime after Jewish Institute for National Security and the Georgia programs. But yeah, by like 2004, 2005, this is like a huge cottage industry. Huge cottage industry kind of contradicts itself, but it's a sizable thing where you're having like very large police delegations. And like, I mean, the image that a lot of people have is that they're actually going to like going through the Israeli police academy and getting like a full like military basic training. It's not that. It's like these are like 1 week seminars where they get flown in, they get wined and dined, and they get shown a bunch of like kind of flashes of what the Israeli security apparatus.
Essentially a junket.
Yeah, I call it a junket in the article. It's a junket, but it's like a junket where they get these like impressionistic flashes of how the inner workings of the Israeli security services. Like they get to see the sort of Big Brother surveillance camera room in Jerusalem. They get to like visit the settlement in Hebron, and see the checkpoints there. They get to,
And in a lot of ways, you get all of your dystopian police state, security state, surveillance state kicks, but laundered through the sort of Zionist righteousness, which makes it okay to enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of the pro-Palestinian like activists kind of, I think they might they kind of don't do themselves any favors with the messaging where, yeah, I think in recent years they've gotten much more careful about being like, this is not an Israel problem, this is an America problem exacerbated by Israel. But like I think the thing you really gotta, and I tried to really emphasize this, is not like American cops learned to do, creepy counterterrorism stuff from Israel. Like for them, it's like, there was a demand for creepy counterterrorism stuff, and Israel was the country that fulfilled that demand.
Also, there's and thinking about the culture of policing in America versus other Western countries. In the U.S., there's a sort of double-sided, on the one hand, libertarian mystique, which is supposed to all be about minimizing the intrusiveness of the police, the power of the security apparatus. But on the other hand, there's also a fetishization, a very strong attraction to that type of high impact, very intrusive, like not particularly rights respecting style of policing, which would be a much harder sell in a country like Germany or New Zealand or Canada.
Well, we have the pervasive infiltration of propaganda in
Absolutely.
American media going back for years, going back to the '60s with I Spy, not I Spy. I forgot the One Adam 12 and all those other programs that were going around during the civil rights era that have been tailored to romanticize police. I mean, police are something that are given a certain particularity in the American media constellation that provides this type of fetishization that I don't see we see with any other apparatus.
And it's also a particular kind, because every country has its murder mysteries, right? Everybody likes a detective that figures out who done it. But in the US, I remember when Antonin Scalia cited Jack Bauer from 24 in a Supreme Court decision as justification for enhanced interrogation, for torture.
Okay, this is a really wild. This is another wild thing where Israel comes in. Basically, so I didn't have like space to get into this in my article, but that not only were it like local police looking to Israel for counterterrorism stuff, Bush administration lawyers were looking at it too. So for example, like targeted killings, like the kind of drone strike stuff we do, the Israelis, pioneered that during the Second Intifada, and they really, I mean, it was like an outlier. It was like, this is a weird situation, and then something that the U.S. kind of condemned as a I don't know if they called it a violation of international law, but certainly like it wasn't. It was something the State Department.
Not cool, bro.
Yeah, not cool, bro. You can't just like kill people from the sky with no warning. But then after 9/11, and again, this was a pervasive thing of like, we want to take the gloves off. Where can we learn to take the gloves off? The Israelis have their gloves off. So Bush administration lawyers started citing the Israeli targeted killing thing as or looking at it as for like legal justification, and with torture. So Israel officially banned torture in 1999. Before that, the Israeli security services like flagrantly used it. And this goes back to like the British Mandate. We can get into the whole history of that. But yeah, and then 1999, the Israeli Supreme Court banned torture, but they kind of allowed this wiggle room like defense. Like you can't you can defend yourself from being prosecuted for torture if it's a ticking time bomb situation. And then suddenly that's what the Bush administration is conjuring up, the idea of like, there's a terrorist and you have to torture them to find out where the bomb is, which, in practice is not how torture works. Like torture, I think the more vulgar, like Trumpian thing is more honest. It's just like, these are bad people, so we should treat them badly. Like torture doesn't actually get you useful information in a timely manner.
Yeah, going back to Beccaria and the Enlightenment, going back to the Roman Empire, you've got Western sources, and I only cite those because they're the ones I'm familiar with, that say you torture to get people to say what you want, not to tell you the truth.
Yeah, there's a really good book. It's called, I think it's called, Black Banners by Ali Soufan. Recently came out. It came out a while ago, but they recently they recently declassified it because there had been like these giant redacted chunks. But it's a memoir of an FBI agent who is on the Al Qaeda file before anyone else, and basically he writes about how not only was torture ineffective, but like they had been getting effective information from a lot of these Al Qaeda guys through like non-torture, old-fashioned police work. Like you sweat people by lying about how much you know, or this like familiarity, or you find out who's got what personal weakness. Old-fashioned COINTELPRO shit, right? But it was like
I remember early on, the case of the Japanese in World War II was given as an example of how far you can get just by building rapport. The possibility of actually getting cooperation rather than coercively extracting information, that seemed to have been ruled out even without any consideration.
Yeah, and so there's a great instances in Black Banners where like the one you posted, the inside story, the Goodreads link, that's the classified one. That's Black Banners Declassified is the new edition. But there's instances in the declassified one where like they've got some guy and the FBI is building rapport and getting good information, and then the CIA comes in and is like, we're gonna do our like freaky, touches ball sack. I mean, that's not what actually they did. They did some weirder, more sadistic stuff. But the CIA comes in and we're going to do the freaky stuff. And then, the information stops coming because they're doing the freaky stuff. And the FBI is like begging to be allowed access. And when they get access to the guy again, he's like traumatized and he's not giving them any information. And then the FBI ends up pulling its agents out of the black site because Ali Soufan, the author, by his own account, starts threatening to arrest the CIA officers because he's like, this is not only getting in my way, but this is also illegal, and I'm going to arrest you. And then the FBI had to pull him out and be like, okay, we're just not going to touch this.
Please don't threaten the other agency.
Yeah.
Matthew, I wanted to ask you, in light of the way in which there's always the consciousness of Israel as a state to maintain this kind of plausible deniability in terms of violence and aggression, how much of these training junkets are about inuring in the consciousness of American police apparatus an overall respect for Israel as a state, as opposed to actually training them in lethality as a mechanism of dealing with suspects?
Oh, I mean, 100%. Again, like they're not getting military style. They're not actually getting like field training. Like you have an instructor teaching them how to shoot or arrest someone, or they're getting speeches. They're going on junkets and they're getting to observe and they're getting speeches. And some of that, there are instances. There's a great quote from an Orlando police chief. I mean, great, like disturbing, but I think on the nose, where he comes back and he says, I can't tell you exactly what I learned, but I sure like those checkpoints and I got some ideas for Orlando. Right, that's not the Israelis teaching him, specific tactics. That's him observing this stuff and being like, I want it. But I think on the Israelis' part, this is just an opportunity to get a captive audience of like Americans from a pretty influential constituency. Like cops have a lot of sway in local politics. Get a captive audience of like influential Americans who are already predisposed to be like impressed by flashy military stuff, and you get a week to like give them your entire national narrative and show them how badass you are. And I mean, if you look, their police departments have gotten a little bit more cautious about giving away this stuff in FOIA requests. Like they were very edgy with me, but before this stuff became a controversy, Alex Kane at Jewish Currents got like an ADL to Israel trip itinerary from a FOIA request, and like it was a lot of the stuff was police specific. Like again, touring the camera room in Jerusalem, but a lot of it was, I think, your standard Israel PR tour stuff of like, we're going to show you the holy sites, we're going to show you the Holocaust Memorial, we're going to show you like the national parks and the beauty of this country. Like it's kind of the standard curriculum for politicians or birthright trips or so and so.
You mentioned, Matthew, something a little while ago, which I wanted to circle back to. So you mentioned that New York was one of the first cities to get involved in these exchanges. How did that come back to cause problems for New York City?
So basically, in the early 2000s, they started this thing called the Demographics Unit, which sounds creepy because it is creepy. They basically, I mean, it's like the prototype of like the FBI sending someone to the mosque to find like the most mentally ill person and incite them to violence. Like the New York Police Department also had like these mosque crawlers that were like trying to egg people on to trying to entrap people basically. And this wasn't part of the public selling of it. After, I mean, it was secret until like 2011, and then it got blown open by these journalists with the AP. Or actually, I don't know if they were with the AP at the time they blew it open, but it got blown open by journalists and then became this huge scandal. The city got sued. Actually, someone I know personally sued New York City for spying on his mosque. A million different civil rights lawsuits, and they had to like basically shut the whole thing down, and it was awful it was just like an awful PR disaster. But yeah, the new NYPD didn't talk about this publicly. I don't think they talked about it in the court proceedings, but privately they were like, yeah, this is based on, it's reported in the book, like by the journalists who blew it open. Like this was based on Israeli intelligence operations in the West Bank. And it makes sense because the Israelis have a program called Mustarabin, or Mustaravim, like I'm mixing the Arabic and the Hebrew, where they have people who are like fluent Arabic speakers, pretend to be Arabs, and go into the West Bank, and it's part of the surveillance dragnet. They have like human informants who are Israelis trained in Hebrew, in Arabic, and like.
Hello, fellow Muslims. Does anybody want to do some jihad today?
Exactly, and that's what the NYPD did. And the NYPD explicitly said this is based on the Israeli model. Again, I don't think this was like the Israelis, gave them the blueprint and were like, do this. I think it was like they were like, how can we take the gloves off? And then, a lot of these cops who had been touring Israel or familiar with the Israeli system said, they've got it right.
Well, this is a very hefty allegation that you're saying here. This is not light. Basically, what you're saying is that the United States post 9/11 strategy of infiltrating Muslim places of worship was taking its kind of model from an Israeli strategy that was being used in the West Bank to deal with Palestinians, and was incorporated into American intelligence and surveillance, partially, if not intentionally, as a consequence of this kind of police, relationship that the U.S. had developed with Israel. So that's a tangible way to demonstrate how there was definitely a metastasizing kind of consequence to the role in which the Israeli state had on American police powers.
Right. I don't think they got this. I don't think this was directly told to them by the Israelis. And like, I don't think Israel's the only country in the world that spies on people through informants, but this was what the NYPD internally used to justify the program, which I think is the important thing here.
And I think that there are a couple of ways in which Israel is particular. And one is just the relationship with the United States and specifically the city of New York, right? There's Israelis, there's a large Israeli American population living in New York. There's a very long history there, which lets ideas good and bad go back and forth. The second is that, well, Israel's security apparatus is conducting an occupation of the Palestinian territories while it's has this very heavy-handed police state. It is still a democracy. It is still a recognized, this is more and more contested, but especially after 9/11, in that period, the Israeli democratic, sort of liberal, free country bona fides were considered to be impeccable. And therefore, this is how a civilized country takes the gloves off. We're not learning from North Korea. We're not learning from China. We're not learning from Belarus. We're learning from Israel. Everybody loves Israel. Like those guys are great. They're tough, but they're a civilized democratic country, the only democracy in the Middle East, as they like to say. And before Israel, that role actually, I think something similar may have taken place with the Anglo-American relationship. When the Brits were torturing IRA people, that's where you could learn how to do that if you were part of, it was not a police relationship, an intelligence agency to intelligence agency transatlantic relationship. But when the Troubles ended, the Israelis became the sort of best model.
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually there's a great quote. One of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America people, Stephen Pomerantz. He was the former FBI official who organized the first post 9/11 trips to Israel, and he wrote in an op-ed later justifying this thing. I don't have the exact quote with me. It's somewhere. I linked to it in the article. But he says this is Israel as an example of a democratic country that knows how to fight terrorism while maintaining democratic norms. Democratic. Well, yeah, democratic for who?
It's hilarious. It's absolutely absurd. On its face.
But I mean, it is interesting. This is the Israeli state doesn't do extra legal police state stuff. All of this stuff has a legal veneer born out of emergency powers, right? And they've been in a legal state of emergency since the British Mandate. They literally inherited, or they claim to inherit, this legal authority from the British colonial authorities. But it's all kind of by the book. It's all kind of regulated brutality, which is what the American post 9/11 system did, right?
We're also talking about a book that allows depopulation agendas for Palestinians. I mean,
and that's the remarkable thing. That's the innovation, because everybody can genocide if you're just breaking the rules. But it is special to be able to align your rule of law society with your apartheid project.
And that's 100% what the Americans did after 9/11. Look at the Guantanamo trials, right? It's not it's not a real trial. It's a kangaroo court. There's no any kind of recourse. Also, they tortured these people. But we're going to set up a system where you have lawyers and a courtroom and someone called a judge wearing some kind of judgy outfit and make it as if it's a legal procedure.
If the TSA is security theater, then we could call the Guantanamo Bay legal proceedings a kind of due process theater.
But it's an important ideological pillar of both the Israeli and the American state, both for external and internal legitimization, right? I think that's the important thing to emphasize. States can get away with a lot of things so long as they launder it through some kind of process, right? I mean, I think that's the critical point here. And perhaps what is more scary about these kind of routinized types of brutality is that they're quite effective. They're an effective structure to maintain this kind of apparatus. and both maintain the facade of democracy and democratic participation, while at the same time, trying to have your cake and eat it. You know what I mean? Because the problem in a lot of states is, even according to their own procedures, the brutality is extra legal, right? But if you
Yeah.
just create a legal framework for it, you can routinize and control the brutality and manage it more effectively.
I mean, one of the things that someone trained as a lawyer, I realized the fascination we have with bourgeois due process and rule of law in these Western countries. But one of the things we have to realize is that it's absolutely bloody arbitrary. And one of the things that you can see from the recent Supreme Court decision is that all of this kind of storied, rule, human rights, the rights of privacy, all of this salient rhetoric that we always see transposed throughout us about the rule of law, the rights based society. That crap is thrown down the toilet whenever it's exigent for whatever particular ruling class tool is in power, or whenever some kind of new threat of the day is hoisted in front of the country, or an internal threat of the day is seen as having to be dealt with. So again, I don't necessarily see the rights based narrative, though I do agree that it's used by Western powers who are also in line with the Israeli narrative of wanting to basically take the bat stick or whatever weapon necessarily to keep the brown folks in check. Yes, that they will do so, but I think that the larger project is about delegitimizing that state apparatus in the first place and realizing that this is a force of coercion.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to before I want to say something that before I go to back, in the book Enemies Within by Matt Apuzzo and Adam Goldman, they're the ones who blew up in this NYPD program. They're talking about the origins of it. There's a few paragraphs about Red Scare surveillance stuff and anti-communist stuff, but Sanchez didn't get his inspiration. Sanchez is the NYPD official. Sanchez didn't get his inspiration from New York's troubled past. Rather, he got the idea from one of America's closest allies, a country that lived under the threat of terrorism for decades. He told friends and colleagues that the NYPD was taking its cue from Israeli officers' methods of keeping tabs on the military-occupied West Bank. Next paragraph has probably a very, very on-the-nose line, better than anything I could write. Sanchez's proposal ignored some important differences between the U.S. and Israel. Brooklyn and Queens, for example, were not occupied territories. There was no security wall being erected in New York City.
And I think that was chilling, and it also conveys the mentality of American police, and one which is out of line with police in other Western advanced countries, or Asian countries as well, places like Japan or South Korea. And the comment frequently comes up: if police say they serve and protect in the United States, who are they serving and who are they protecting? Because it's not the public. The public is treated like an occupied, hostile population, a subject population. And when police officers describe, I'm going out every day, risking my life, you don't know the dangers that I face all the time, and I have to keep myself safe. This is not a police officer's credo. This is a soldier's credo, an occupier's credo.
Yeah, and to go back to what Pascal was saying about Supreme Court decisions, I mean, there was a recent decision about how you basically don't have any recourse against immigration authorities when they against minor mistakes that can ruin your life. And I think that's another great example. Like, the Supreme Court will, be really exacting on how much the EPA can regulate carbon. But when it comes to immigration authorities being able to break into your house, violate all of your civil rights, insofar as they exist, and then throw you out of the country. That's the crazy thing about the immigration system to me, is that it's another fake court. It's not part of the judicial branch. It's the judges are Department of Justice employees. The feds are playing judge, jury, and executioner, and you have less protections against that than against a parking ticket. I'm not a parking ticket, a speeding ticket. You can fight a speeding ticket in like a neutral court, and you have a right to your day before an actual judge. But like if you're a non-citizen or you're a citizen who gets mistaken for a non-citizen and can't prove it immediately on the spot, then you have less rights than that, and they can basically destroy your entire life. They can make you a non-person.
And that's the way that the Guantanamo center, the prison, was set up was precisely to prevent any combatant, any enemy that the United States secured abroad, any individual, from ever becoming a legal person with constitutional protections. So you keep them out of, you prevent them from being prisoners of war, because that would at least be the Geneva Convention, and you also keep them out of American territory, out of formal U.S. custody, which prevents any constitutional protections. They become non-persons, as you say, just like non-citizens.
Which goes back to another Supreme Court decision, I think, at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, which divided those parts of the world under, official American control and unofficial American control, and did not extend constitutional rights to territories and I think non-incorporated areas, so that all kinds of legal black holes exist. But it is, I think it is important to understand the distinction between, and this is not a moral or normative distinction, but between the way that power is being exercised, the difference between where you have an arbitrary system that works on the whim of an official who has no process or behind what they're doing, and this kind of bureaucratized and legalized, tyranny. I don't know if there's another word for it, but like you create an entire legal apparatus to scaffold a kind of very arbitrary and brutal system in order to disguise it and hide it from the broader public through this sanitized language of process. For example, I'll do an Ottoman Empire example. In the 18th or before the 19th century, if the Sultan didn't like the Grand Vizier, he strangled him to death. He got strangled to death. But Abdul Hamid, who came to power in the late 19th century after the creation of a big bureaucratic apparatus, he couldn't just strangle his rebellious Grand Vizier. He had to put him on trial, send him into exile, use the constitutional provisions that allowed him to do those things. And then
you have to go through the HR department.
You have to go through the HR department. So I think it's very, I think it's important to recognize this, not because there's a moral distinction between it, but because we have this entire legal apparatus and structure and language, which sounds like a language of rights to people. It sounds like a language of due process, but it's not. It's obfuscating what is a arbitrary and tyrannical legal superstructure.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things I think that one of the things that we who are oppositional to these systems at our best, what we can do is to dislodge the cloud and the fog the legal system has in the consciousness of citizens, excuse me, who are trained to believe that it's some kind of allocation of justice and rights. When we realize, because we know throughout history, that the brief period of time, particularly with the Supreme Court, in which it was any type of humane arbiter of a decent standard of legal rights, is the post-Lochner, post-New Deal era, which is of course it's Cold War geopolitics. Most of those decisions are being done in line with America's foreign image abroad, being in consideration of how we're being viewed in competition with the rise of Soviet competition in the consciousness of the third and developing world. But if you actually look at the long history of Supreme Court jurisprudence and federal court jurisprudence, it's been ridiculously tyrannical. I mean, from Lochner to Duplessis versus Ferguson, Dred Scott, the court has not been a friend of the rights of the citizens by any stretch of the imagination. in its overall long-term history. And sadly, because we've been deluded with this small window through the Warren courts and the period that starts with the 30s in the rise of Nazi Germany up until the early 70s, we've been deluded into believing that somehow this is some kind of bastion of liberty. It's not. It's a reactionary, counter-majority, anti-democratic institution that is rooted in reaction and protecting the interests of capital.
Corey Robin has really good stuff on that. I mean, he kind of called this before anyone else that, when people were talking about Trump being a constitutional crisis and this and that, he's like, no. If we get tyranny, I mean, tyranny is another word like terrorism. It's so vague. Like, I hate to use it. It's just, but if we do get this kind of like authoritarian, if we get, if we get brutality, a more brutal political system, it's not going to come from 1/6 style. And he said this stuff before 1/6 even, but not from like, this like street fighting, chaotic, arbitrary stuff. But it's going to be through the right using anti-majoritarian institutions like the Senate and the Supreme Court to just, legally, procedurally ram stuff through that most people don't want.
Well, not even that, not even just the Republicans, but also even the Democrats, because, after the election of Barack Obama, what happened with the entire national security apparatus of the war on terror? Obama just codified and legalized it and created procedures for it, right? So, there's a kind of both party complicity in the, in the creation of a kind of legal apparatus for the abuse of individual rights.
And I'm glad you brought up Obama, because his concession or his response to the idea that there's an unaccountable drone strike program, which is extrajudicially murdering people around the world, was
including American citizens,
was, well, I'm just going to pick who gets hit, and because I'm the president, that'll make it legal because that's your due process.
But even then, there was like a whole set of guidelines and like delegation and targeting authority.
There were memos, right?
Yeah, and lawyers. There were lawyers.
It's really creepy.
Reign of Terror by Spencer Ackerman. It's about how Obama kind of legitimized war of terror stuff. I mean, it's about a lot of stuff. But there's another one. Sorry that this is a great use of Zoom bookshelf. Someone commented that.
Yeah, he's using his bookshelf. It's the bookshelf in action.
It's not a prop.
It's real. Matthew's given us some good book reviews.
I can't find the book. Oh, Humane by Samuel Moyne. Actually, this ties all this stuff together because it's a book, basically about the rise of like human rights, or international humanitarian law in war, where like it's not all fake, right? After Vietnam, there was a move towards having lawyers in the room when you make targeting decisions. And it doesn't make it less brutal. The point Samuel Moyne makes is it doesn't make war less violent or warlike. But there is some kind of change there where like the system actually doesn't want to just be, mowing people down with napalm. It wants to have this veneer of legality where someone in the room wrote a memo about why you can, burn people with napalm.
I mean, you also, I think that it has less to do with the legitimacy of the attack, right? The legitimacy of the bombing, the legitimacy of targeting, and more with the legitimacy of punishing somebody who kills the wrong person or does it in too obvious a way or otherwise compromises the mission through excessive, counter-utilitarian brutality, like the My Lai massacre, right? You having that lawyer in the room allows the person you're disciplining is the military official, right? Like, and the person you're protecting is the political leadership. It's not the civilians in the field.
Just to say we did our due process. But to bring it back around to your article, Matthew, so what is the end point of this kind of exchange program? Why does it start going south? Why is it like not the hot ticket that it once was?
Right. Well, I think a big part of it is Black Lives Matter and the fact. I mean, there's a long history of like Black Palestinian solidarity and identifying the two struggles together. But I mean, when Black Lives Matter, when the round of, I mean, this movement I think started in the early 2010s, but when in 2014, post 2014, with Ferguson and Michael Brown, it was just too on the nose that you had like cops, St. Louis cops in like riot gear, militarized riot gear, chasing people down. And at the same time, you had another outbreak of war in Gaza. And then you had Palestinians on Twitter saying, hey, that's the same brand of tear gas. I know how to avoid it. And you had the fact that the St. Louis County police chief had actually done an ADL trip in Israel. And you had the fact that I'm blanking on his name, but a big Ferguson activist was Palestinian American Bassem Masri, and you had the fact that people like Angela Davis, who had a long history of solidarity with Palestinians, were commenting like Ferguson. She had a quote: "Ferguson, you could mistake Ferguson for Gaza" or something like that. So all these things percolating in social media and in people's conscience at the same time made it a little bit toxic. And like the opposition starts in left wing circles, but something like the ADL does not want this to be a loud public debate. The ADL is representing at the end of the day, it's operating in the same left wing circles and it's positioning itself as a civil rights group. And so I think the formal campaign against it starts with this Jewish Voice for Peace, which is one of the big pro-Palestine organizations. And they get a lot of like Black Lives Matter and pro-Palestine and Muslim American groups to sign on, but they're the ones spearheading it. They start to just like FOIA request stuff and protest us at the ADL and just make a lot of noise about it. And, I think the ADL was the first domino to fall in this. So they published that they suspended their trips for COVID. Oh, it also the 2021 the outbreak of violence May 2021, which starts through Jerusalem and starts through attempting to evict. I mean, the real focal point of it was like police brutality in the old city of Jerusalem, and attempting to evict the El Kurd family, who are not Kurdish as far as I'm aware, in recent years. Maybe the Kurds 800 years ago, but from the old city of Jerusalem. From Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, those two things kind of kick off a whole round of like violence all across Israel, Palestine. But the initial things that started it were kind of on the nose and reminded a lot of people of the racial dynamics in America. There was this one video that went viral of this guy. He's a guy from I think Brooklyn. His name's Jacob Fauci. Funny enough, but he was this Israeli nationalist. The Sheikh Jarrah homes and the El Kurd family, it's a weird, complicated legal question of like.
Sheikh Jarrah is actually an old Jewish quarter, if I'm not mistaken. But of course, when the population and ethnic cleansing and counter-ethnic cleansing took place, the Jewish community was forced to Israel, and that place came to be inhabited by Muslims and Christians. But of course, after 1967, with the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem, of Eastern Jerusalem, of course, that question of the ownership of the houses and the territories in that particular district has become a live question, especially with settler groups and groups that might have title claims to houses in that district dating back to the British or the Ottoman period. Of course, making familial claims on houses that have been lived in for 70 years by Palestinian families.
More or less. Yeah, it's a little more complicated because I think it was mixed. It was mixed neighborhood before the war. Yeah. But yeah, there were previously Jewish houses that Jews were kicked out during the 48 Civil War that led to the creation of Israel and the expulsion of Palestinians. And yeah, now there's like settler groups and Israeli nationalist groups who are basically, and this is an interesting thing, right? It goes back to this legalized brutality, right? This is not like the immediate post-1967 world where the Israeli army is going to bulldoze the house and hand over the land to someone. This is people who are actually pulling out land titles and counter titles and doing a court battle. But the conversation ended up, I think, a kind of quiet. There was a quiet part out loud moment where this guy Jacob Fauci, this Israeli nationalist guy, gets in an argument with the Palestinian inhabitants in one of the houses, where he just goes, "If I don't steal it, someone else will." And this 10-second video gets captured and becomes viral, and it's like so on the nose. And this is happening when there's another round of like interest in Black Lives Matter and American racial justice. And so again, it becomes like a live issue in American politics. And like, Cori Bush, who I think was elected in 2020, was a veteran Ferguson protester and also very vocally pro-Palestinian. And she made this very eloquent speech about the connection between the two oppressions, about how the same equipment that they're brutalizing us with, they're brutalizing Palestinians with, etc. So like, yeah, this became an issue that, like, for a group like the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, they're a right-wing group. They got right-wing funders. They don't give a crap. But the ADL, which is a liberal group or positions itself as a liberal group, can't afford that kind of controversy. And so they end up being the first domino to fall. It'll be interesting to see what the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange and the Jewish Institute for National Security end up doing afterwards. And yeah, so the ADL hasn't officially ended these programs, but they like suspended them for COVID. Then they had that internal memo saying maybe we should not do these, and then they just like never resumed them. They quietly never resumed them. Like when Jewish Currents got access to the memo, which was in 2022, so 2 years later, I don't know why it was leaked at that time. They asked ADL, and the ADL vice president said, well, no, like our final, the memo you saw was just a draft, and our final recommendation was to resume the program with an updated curriculum. They never did. And then when I reached out to the ADL office in Georgia for comment on this article, they said, we don't do Israel training programs, which is like, wait, so do you guys or do you not? But I think they don't want to look like they've caved to pressure, but I think it's safe to say that they're not doing this anymore. But again, it's going to be interesting to see what the more right-wing coded programs do. I do suspect it's going to be a little bit more toxic for police departments to say yes to this stuff. And like even the right-wing coded programs, like the Georgia International Law Enforcement, Robert Friedman is not a left-wing guy. He's publicly a big war on terror guy, a big like hates, leftists and pro-Palestine people, and has written some things that are pretty out, right-wing coded. But even he is going in the media now and saying, well, my programs are actually teaching people to be less brutal. Like he has this whole thing about how LaGrange, Georgia adopted a shoot to incapacitate instead of shoot to kill policy.
Nice.
Based on
that's progress.
Yeah. But like he's defending it in this terms, which means that he feels political pressure, which means that even the right-wing coded programs, I think, understand that this is because, like, being a full-on like, pro-Palestine boycott Israel type is still a very far left position in America. But even with like, centrist reasonable people, or not reasonable, but centrist, liberals, yeah, if you have to be like, yes, I'm bringing the police to learn counterterrorism in a country that's been at war continuously for its entire existence, even they're going to like scratch their heads and be like, is that really necessary? So you have to, now that the left is putting out this claim, even if you don't accept it or you dismiss it as fringe, you still have to come up with an answer to that claim.
Because you have funders, you have members, you've got a mailing list, you have the people that you're interacting with socially, and none of them are going to necessarily be Marxist or left-wing in that sense, but they want to think of themselves as good liberal people on the right side of history and on the right side of the moral issues of the day. So if you make them feel uncomfortable, they'll just stop supporting you.
And not just that, I think more generally, I think you're right, of course, Matthew, like full-on pro-Palestinian BDS, all that kind of activism is still very marginal in the United States, and there's a lot of money being thrown against it. But I think one of the interesting developments of the last, let's say, 15 and 20 years is the growing unease amongst, like you say, just normal liberals about Israel and the Israeli project, as the kind of contradictions between the image of Israel that historically prevailed in the United States as a bastion of liberal democracy in the Middle East increasingly just jars with the reality of what people see, on their televisions. And even to a certain extent, when you see liberal defenders of Israel moving away from a discourse which says Israel is a democracy defending itself towards a discourse that is like, well, yeah, but we have, you go like, oh, it's an apartheid state, and instead of saying no, it's not, you just get a whole bunch of reasons why it has to be an apartheid state. It's like
I'm just waiting for them to make the full turn and go, look, opposing apartheid is white supremacy culture. We've got our own traditions. Stop trying to oppress us.
Well, yeah, that's true. Well, we have hit the hour, so it is time for us to go to the fun half. So, Matthew, we're going to send you another link. We're going to say goodbye to everybody. Pascal, do you have any final words?
Matthew, I very much enjoyed your piece. I found it fascinating that it was in Reason.
We can go back in the fun half.
We'll talk about that in Funhouse.
For sure. And thank you for coming on with your Fonzie hair. And I hope you enjoyed your dinner while we talked. And hopefully you come on again.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. No, this was really great opportunity to talk about stuff.
Well,
fascinating article. Real pleasure.
May I add one more thing?
Yeah.
So, yeah, like you said with the unease, I mean, I think that's, again, with the police stuff, I don't think that all these groups, especially the right-wing coded ones, are going to drop the programs. But even then, just the fact that it is a controversy and that there's a public discourse that they have to answer is become like kind of a nuisance. And I think that's the BDS movement. I don't know how successful they'll be, but I think more than the economic damage is the fact that they make these things controversial and that they create a public discourse. That's what like their real effect on the course of these things is that they've created a discourse, and now you have to have a defense of these things, when before you could just take it for granted.
Well, on that concluding point, as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.